Thanks so much for including me in this conference. I'm really excited to be here. So today I'm going to talk about some of my research surrounding virtue signaling and reputation motives and moral outrage. In October 2017, the New York Times reported that film producer Harvey Weinstein had been accused by more than a dozen women of sexual harassment, assault, and rape. And in response, Weinstein was condemned by millions of people on social media platforms, fired from his production company, left by his wife, and finally convicted of rape in a court of law. And these responses reflect a key feature of our moral nature as humans, which is that we have an appetite for moralistic punishment and outrage. We respond to wrongdoers with condemnation and punishment, even as third-party observers who have not ourselves been directly harmed or affected in any way. And this fact that we are willing to punish even as third parties is puzzling because punishing can be costly to individuals. It can take time and effort, it can result in retaliation from the people that we punish, and it can cause us to forego beneficial interactions with those people, raising the question of why people are punishing wrongdoing towards other people. And in this talk, I want to support two key claims. The first is that reputation concerns provide a powerful motivation to punish on behalf of others. And the second is that this motivation is actually so powerful that it even encourages people to punish when they're not personally sure that punishment is actually deserved. And starting with this first claim, evidence suggests that one reason that we punish wrongdoers is that punishing can make us appear virtuous in the eyes of others. And these reputational benefits can serve to offset the costs of punishing. So for example, when our friend Nicholas here condemns Weinstein for his wrongdoing, one consequence is that he can signal to other people that he can be trusted not to commit wrongdoing himself and to behave in a way that is moral and respectful of social norms. And this can serve to boost his reputation. Yet to date, evidence that reputation can fuel punishment has mostly come from contexts like the Weinstein case, in which the moral case for punishment is relatively unambiguous and clear-cut. In the case of Weinstein, almost everyone can agree that he is guilty of severe wrongdoing and deserving of severe punishment. And most experiments investigating the role that reputation plays in encouraging punishment has created situations like this, in which participants are sure that an intentional act of wrongdoing has occurred, and the punishment in question feels proportionate to the offense, creating a clear moral case for punishment. And in these types of unambiguous cases, what reputational incentives serve to do is they serve to sort of align what people think is morally good and appropriate and what they think is in their self-interest. In the absence of reputation, people might think that someone like Weinstein deserves to be punished, but also feel sort of willing to pay the personal costs required to punish. But if they expect punishing to boost their reputation, now doing the right thing is actually also the thing that's in their self-interest in the long run. And so insofar as people act on reputational incentives for punishment, reputation is going to serve to encourage people to live up to what they personally see as right. Yet in other cases, the moral case for punishment is not so clear-cut. It can be much more ambiguous. So this is an article discussing the case of Al Franken, who was a Democratic US senator who was pushed to resign from his post as senator following a number of sexual harassment allegations that for many people left a somewhat more equivocal impression. And while some people thought it was the right thing for Franken to resign, other people did not. And the sort of morality of this punishment still remains debated today. There are also contexts where people are confident that punishment was merited, but maybe not confident that the particular punishment in question was moral or appropriate in its scope or magnitude. So perhaps many people are familiar with this anecdote of a woman named Justine Sacco, who wrote a racist tweet that while she was on a flight, totally blew up and became sort of the #1 worldwide trend on Twitter. And so this had huge consequences for Sacco's life. And some people felt that even if punishment was merited, this punishment was not morally appropriate because it went too far. And so these examples highlight that sometimes the punishments that are proposed or enacted create a more ambiguous impression for people. Not everybody sees them as morally justified. And these examples highlight that in ambiguous cases, there's the potential for reputational incentives for punishment to actually introduce a tension between what people think is morally good and right and what they think is in their self-interest. And in particular, there's an interesting scenario where people may personally be unsure that punishment is deserved, but yet expect punishing to look good and therefore to be in their self-interest. And insofar as people act on reputational incentives in this scenario, reputation may actually serve to push people away from what they think is right. But there's an interesting psychological question, which is, do people actually respond to reputational incentives for punishment even when they personally question whether punishment is merited? And I want to argue that the answer is yes, because reputation motives are so powerful that they even encourage us to punish when we're unsure that punishment is deserved. And so I'm going to present some data supporting this that is joint work with my collaborator, Nora Katili at Kellogg. And we conducted a series of online experiments in which we recruited liberal participants to read a purportedly real newspaper article about sexual harassment allegations against a university professor. And we varied whether we created an ambiguous or unambiguous moral case for punishment. And in particular, we recruited liberal subjects because we wanted subjects to be confident that the moral domain in question, in this case sexual harassment, was one that they would typically receive reputational benefits from punishing. We then gave subjects the opportunity to punish this university professor by donating money that they would otherwise get to keep to a purportedly real group of organizers trying to get this professor fired through a relatively extreme strategy of sort of marching outside of his office and personal residence, trying to get the university to fire him and expose his behavior to the people he knew. And we manipulated whether or not there were reputational consequences to subjects' decisions to punish. So we told subjects that another participant, who I'm going to refer to as a decider, would receive an endowment of money and choose how much money to share with the subject. And in the private condition, we told subjects, this decider is not going to learn anything about the sexual harassment allegations or your decision of whether or not to punish. So there were no reputation consequences to punishing. But in the public condition, we told participants that the decider would learn about the allegations and find out whether or not they punished the professor. So there were reputation consequences, and there was the potential that punishing could make the subject look virtuous and good in the eyes of the decider. We also manipulated the ambiguity of the moral case for punishment by varying the details we put in this purportedly real article about the harassment allegations. In contrast to the ambiguous condition, in the unambiguous condition, there were relatively more accusers, there was better evidence for their allegations, and they were claiming that more serious transgressions had occurred. And so together we hoped that we would create a relatively clear-cut moral case for punishment in the unambiguous condition, but a murkier case in the ambiguous condition. And indeed, we found that in the ambiguous condition, subjects were personally much less morally supportive of punishing. So I'm going to show you data, a histogram from subjects' responses to a series of questions that we used to sort of create a measure of their personal moral evaluation of punishment. And this was questions like, how confident are you that the allegations are true? How moral or proportionate or appropriate do you think the group of organizers' strategy is for holding this professor accountable? And these data come from the private condition of our paradigm where reputation was not part of the picture. And so what we see is that in the unambiguous condition, subjects are much more personally supportive of punishment. They see punishment as much more deserved and appropriate. And so in the first study I'm going to talk about, we wanted to ask how readily will our reputation manipulation, in which we introduce reputational consequences to punishing, encourage people to punish in the ambiguous and unambiguous conditions of this experiment. And to create a fair test, what we wanted to do was make it so that people faced equally strong incentives to punish reputationally in both the ambiguous and unambiguous conditions, so that we could test the power of reputation in these ambiguous and unambiguous cases. And so to create equally strong reputational incentives in the ambiguous and unambiguous conditions, we varied the way that we described the decider. In the ambiguous condition, we told subjects that the decider was a Democrat who supports the Me Too movement. Whereas in the unambiguous condition, we simply describe the decider as a Democrat. So in the unambiguous condition, on the one hand, the case for punishment was morally stronger, but on the other hand, subjects might have expected the Democrat who supports the Me Too movement to be relatively more supportive of punishing. And in a pre-test experiment, we found that this approach successfully created equally strong perceived reputational incentives to punish in the ambiguous and unambiguous conditions of our paradigm. So now I'm going to show you a histogram from a pretest looking at the public conditions of our paradigm where subjects expected the decider to find out whether or not they punished. And in this pretest, what we did is we asked subjects, how positively will the decider evaluate you if you do versus do not punish? And high numbers on this graph are going to show that subjects expect punishing to look better in the eyes of the decider to gain larger reputational benefits from punishing. And what we see is that when we describe the decider as a Democrat in the unambiguous condition, but a Democrat who supports the Me Too movement in the ambiguous condition, subjects in both conditions expect the decider to react similarly positively to punishing. So they perceive equally strong reputation-based pressure to punish. And so what this means is then we can sort of cross our manipulation of reputation, our public versus private manipulation, with whether we assign subjects to the unambiguous condition and tell them the decider is a Democrat versus assign subjects to the ambiguous condition and tell them that the decider is a Democrat who supports the Me Too movement. And this design allows us to ask, how readily will equally strong reputational incentives encourage punishment that is either ambiguously or unambiguously deserved? So starting with the unambiguous condition, we find that subjects are more likely to punish in public than in private. And this highlights the idea that reputation gives people a reason to pay personal costs to punish wrongdoing towards somebody else. So subjects are more willing to give up money to do what we know they think is the right thing. Because remember, I showed you in the unambiguous condition, subjects think punishment is really morally good. But they're much more willing to pay a personal cost to actually do that morally good thing when they expect that punishing can make them look virtuous in the eyes of the decider. Now the question is, are people still going to readily respond to reputational incentives in the ambiguous condition when the reputational incentives are encouraging them to enact punishment they're much less confident is deserved? And we find that the answer is yes. Even in the ambiguous condition, our reputation manipulation encourages people to punish. And in fact, it does just as much to encourage people to punish in the ambiguous condition as the unambiguous condition. So we find no difference in the power of the reputation manipulation across conditions. Now, of course, subjects are much less likely to punish in the ambiguous condition. So their personal moral values do matter for their decisions. They're sort of restrained from punishing in the ambiguous condition on the basis that they're less sure that punishment is deserved. But interestingly, their reservations about punishment do not restrain them from being sensitive to reputation. So reputation is able to encourage punishment even when it's pushing people in a direction they're much less confident is good. And so this sort of suggests that reputational incentives can readily encourage even ambiguously deserved punishment. But a question remains open, which is which subjects in the ambiguous condition are responding to this reputation manipulation? Does the influence of reputation extend even to the individual subjects who were personally unsure that punishment was moral? Or was it driven by the minority of individuals in the ambiguous condition who were actually confident that punishment was morally appropriate? So to address this question, I'm just going to show you one more study where we measure subjects' personal moral evaluations of punishment before even telling them that they're going to have the opportunity to punish and that their reputation may or may not be at stake. So before subjects even learn that they're going to choose whether or not to support the punishing organizers and find out about the exchange with the decider, we ask them to read the newspaper allegation, learn about the organizer's approach, and decide how moral they think it is to punish. And then after that, we introduce our reputational manipulation. And in this study, we always assign people to the ambiguous condition because we're interested in individual variation in perceptions of morality within that condition. And again, we also always tell them that the decider is a Democrat who supports the Me Too movement so that we create a strong reputational incentive to punish. And so we can ask, does the influence of reputation extend even to subjects with personal reservations about the morality of punishment? So I'm showing here the scale we use to measure subjects' moral evaluations. Any number below 5, which was labeled with the phrase, I have reservations, these are people who are sort of personally unsure that punishment is deserved. And we bin people into 4 different bins, sort of looking at their initial support for punishment. And then we can now ask, what is the influence of our reputation manipulation in these different groups of individuals? And what we find is that all bins show a sensitivity to our reputation manipulation. So even people who are initially quite unsupportive of punishment and don't think it's a very good idea are more likely to punish when they can gain reputational benefits and appear virtuous in the eyes of a salient audience, suggesting that reputation can encourage people to punish even when it's encouraging them to do something they don't think is right. And so this supports the conclusion that not only do reputation concerns provide us with a powerful motivation to punish on behalf of others, but actually that this motivation is so powerful that it can even encourage punishment that people are personally unsure is deserved. And so I think these results really highlight the importance of reputation and virtue signaling concerns in shaping our sense of moral outrage and our willingness to punish wrongdoing towards alleged or actual transgressions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting. Just one quick question before we transition over to Chris Bale. Just thinking about reputation systems online, where we kind of keep track of somebody's identity over time. Usually we would think, okay, better than anonymity is having some kind of persistent identity where you can build up a reputation. And so I think if I'm following correctly, this would suggest that there could be downsides to that as well, because it can create some of these other sorts of incentives. And so designers or reputation systems might want to think about that downside.
Thanks. I agree. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I think maybe we'll return with some more questions, but I think we'll turn to Chris Bale from Duke. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks so much, Dean, for the invitation, and Sinan and Sandy. Thanks also to Carrie for organizing all of this. And as much as I would love to be staring out at the freezing Charles River water, I'm really excited to check out so many of these seemingly fascinating parallel presentations that you all put together. So I want to talk today about an emerging line of research in the social sciences that employs automated accounts, or bots, to study human behavior. This isn't going to be a comprehensive overview of all the impressive work that's going on in this area, especially work outside the social sciences, but it's going to be an attempt to take stock of some of the currents that I think will guide us into the future and some of the future challenges that might lie ahead. So to begin, let me just say a few words about what I mean by bot-based research. I think when a lot of people think about bots, they think of foreign misinformation campaigns, kind of malicious actors trying to spread misinformation or sow discord on social media. And this is an enormously important topic of study that many of you have done work on, and I myself have done work on, but that's not what I want to talk about today. I also don't want to focus on the field of machine behavior, another really fascinating multidisciplinary effort to kind of understand how AI is shaping human behavior at scale by examining how automation is shaping things like the economy, healthcare, or marketing, and really trying to get at the interaction between humans and algorithms in these kind of real world settings. Instead, I want to talk about repurposing bots for social science research. So these are studies in which researchers create some kind of automated agent or bot and then observe research participants interacting with them, either in kind of bespoke online environments that we create or in the field on social media platforms like Twitter. So in my review of this kind of really young literature, I identified kind of 3 types of research that has leveraged bots in the social sciences. The first is pretty simplistic. It just employs bots or some kind of automated account to expose people to some new type of message, information, or behavior. The second is a little more sophisticated. People are actually interacting with bots in, again, often in online environments that are bespoke or created by the researchers. And the goal in these studies is often to kind of examine how people behave to elicit some type of behavioral response. So we move from some kind of exposure or impression model to a kind of behavioral outcome. And the third type of research that I think is really represents the cutting edge of the field, but also creates some of the most significant challenges for causal inference, is those studies that look at how people communicate with bots. And in this line, we're looking at things like chatbots, often again embedded in customized online environments that researchers create in order to observe how people might interact with another human, or I think even more interestingly, how a automated agent can shape how other groups of people in multi-agent systems interact with each other. So in my talk today, I'm going to try to walk through these three types of bot-based research and give a few examples. But I want to close by talking about the kind of frontiers, specifically some of the challenges that I think so many of us are interested in who do digital research, issues related to validity and reliability in bot-based research, and of course, ethical concerns as we're able to create increasingly realistic AI in our studies. So I'll begin with again, a simple example of bot-based research. And these are cases, again, where bots are simply being used to expose people to messages, to spread information, or to propagate some kind of information across some type of social system. So again, this is a relatively simplistic bot, but it has some nice features that make it easily scalable into real-world settings. So for example, 2 years ago, our polarization lab at Duke wanted to study how social media echo chambers shape political polarization. And so, you could study this in many different ways. You could bring people into a lab and show them kind of counter-attitudinal messages, and then try to see whether those messages kind of create some type of effect on their political opinions. But, there's a number of significant challenges in doing that type of work. There's Hawthorne effects, experiment effects, expressive responding, and probably most importantly, we don't know whether those effects would persist outside the lab as people interact with each other in kind of real world settings. So we wanted to try to do a field experiment on this. And we recruited a large group of Democrats and Republicans who use Twitter 3 times a week to complete a survey about their political views. 1 week later, we sent them a seemingly unrelated invitation to follow a bot that they were told would retweet 24 messages each day. And we designed these bots to simply retweet messages from a group of opinion leaders that we identified through some network sampling of elected officials in the United States. And really all the bot was doing, it's simply, a tiny little script that is just searching, randomly selecting the name of a opinion leader. This could be a media organization or a elected official or some kind of pundit, and determining via Twitter's API whether or not that person has tweeted in the last hour. And if they did, the bot simply retweets the message. So it's very hands-off, no AI, no real intelligence. It's simply retweeting a message. And then in this experiment, we resurveyed everyone at the end of the month in order to try to estimate the effect of exposure to our bots on their political attitudes. And if you're interested in the outcome of this research, the citation here is on the left. I also discussed this research and a major follow-up experiment that also used a similar type of bot that exposed people to new messages in a new book I'm writing called Breaking the Social Media Prism. So again, this is the kind of very basic form of bot-based research. There's a number of other nice examples, especially in the political realm. But again, my goal here today isn't to provide an exhaustive review of the literature, but to try to identify some of the currents. So the second main type of research that I think is really promising in bot-based research is where we create bots that can actually interact with human subjects on our platforms. And when I say on our platforms here, I think most of these examples will involve custom environments that researchers have created, and we deploy our bots on those platforms. One of the really nice things about controlling the platform is that we can really control and account for or manipulate the social environment in which people are interacting with bots. So the second study I'll talk about is a new paper, brand new paper, which is actually going to be presented at one of the parallel sessions on Friday. This is work with Iman Jahani, Natalie Gallagher, Nicolo Cavalli, Fridolin Merhut, Jan Long, and Doug Gibo, in which we wanted to look again at political polarization, but we wanted to look at a behavioral outcome. And here we adopted a kind of conventional wisdom of crowds style model where we recruit people to use an online platform to estimate the answer to a kind of difficult to answer question. And they're given multiple opportunities to adjust their answers after seeing the responses of other people they think are playing the game. The innovation in this study is that there are no other people playing in the game. There's only a bot that is impersonating a member of the opposing party. So we've got Republicans who are incentivized to accurately answer this question, collaborating with a Democrat and vice versa. And here what you see is a really interesting opportunity again to measure under what conditions will collaboration happen. And we have kind of an interesting, I think, behavioral measure of polarization, which takes us deeper than the kind of attitudinal measures that I mentioned in the first study. It also importantly gives us the opportunity to control deliver treatments before and after interactions to see how those interactions unfold. In this case, we developed a theory based on kind of long-standing tradition in the social sciences that exposure to a common enemy would reduce polarization. So people, in this case, who read a scary article about the combined threat of Iran, China, and Russia would be more likely to collaborate with members of the political party, opposite political party. Now, if you've been alive in 2020, you know that nobody's cooperating with anyone, and so you probably won't be too surprised to find that this intervention did not reduce polarization. If you come to the talk on Friday, you'll actually learn how it increased polarization, seemingly, and also with some nice kind of discussion of a natural experiment involving the Iran crisis that occurred during our fieldwork. But I'm not here today to talk about that experiment in particular, but bot-based research. And here again, the innovation is behavioral. We have a behavioral measure. The great cost of this, of course, is that one has to create a custom online environment. This one was created using Abdullah Al-Matouk's Empirica platform, and I'll give some resources to access that later in the talk for those of you who might want to try out this kind of work. So the third and I think most advanced line of research in this area is kind of actual chatbots that are communicating with research participants. And I think there's relatively few examples of this so far. Of course, there's older traditions, for example, work on Eliza, the Rogerian chatbot that delivered psychotherapy seemingly very effectively to folks in as far back as the 1970s. But what's really exciting about the current moment is that we have a lot of new platforms where we can deploy chatbots where it's really ambiguous as to whether or not they are a robot, I think it's fair to say. And I'm really fond of this study that came out earlier this year by Traeger et al. This is research out of the Christakis lab at Yale. And this has nothing to do with polarization, but it's a really interesting study in which people collaborated to complete train tracks. So you see in the screenshot here, 4 players, and each one is laying tracks for a train that needs to navigate different environments. But the interesting innovation here is that one of the 4 players is always a bot. And the researchers wanted to do is see how communicative acts during the game would affect collaboration and teamwork. And interestingly, what they were able to do is deliver different types of communicative acts or language via the bot. So in one condition, the bot delivered relatively neutral messages, about the game or about the strategy in the game. In another condition, the bot was silent. And in a third condition, the bot delivered vulnerable or humorous messages, things like kind of corny jokes or self-deprecating humor. And the really interesting outcome of this study, to my mind, was not that it shaped how people interact with the bot. It actually seemingly seemed to have the most remarkable effects on the humans playing with each other. So, for example, robots who spoke vulnerably in this one of these three conditions increased the amount of communication among other human research participants in the game, but also the equity of that time. And those same people rated the experience as more favorable and enjoyable, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of an interesting case of how robots, particularly when they're embedded in multi-agent systems, can have effects not just at the dyadic level, but at this kind of multi-agent and distributed level. The great challenge, of course, is developing natural language in these settings that is plausible. Here, the researchers were simply using a relatively straightforward rule-based chatbot that simply delivers from a list of messages. And of course, developing a more lifelike chatbot that could, for example, pass the Turing test is something that I think we're still, some way away from, at least to pass the Turing test with regularity. But I think eventually, especially with new technologies like GPT-3 and other new innovations in NLP, we're going to get closer and closer. And so I think as we navigate the future of this field, research with bots in the social sciences, we have to consider at least these three poles. So the first and maybe most obvious is the ethical one. New issues arise. Do we have a duty to tell people that they're interacting with bots? At what point do we owe people that information, and at what point should we intervene? And this problem was identified as long ago as the ELIZA study that I mentioned earlier, where we discovered that people would reveal relatively personal details about their lives to a bot. This raises obvious issues around privacy, but also upon deception, informed consent, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of these are solvable. We can tell people they may interact with a bot, but then we introduce kind of new issues surrounding validity. More specifically, if people are on the lookout for a bot, how does this interrupt the human behavior that we are trying to describe? And even though in some settings, for example, the second study I mentioned, where we are simply simulating guesses in an online game, I think it's fair to say it would be very difficult to determine that you're playing with a bot. In other cases, it might not be so difficult, and particularly as we try to innovate around natural language. And there we face a new series of challenges, some of them old, the uncanny valley, for example, the tendency for people to like bots until they become too lifelike. And there seems to be something distinctly human about our ability to kind of sniff out too human artificial behavior. And so this raises an additional concern around validity. The other pole, and probably the thing that's I think most useful about bot-based research, is that we can deliver very reliable behavior. So we can train a bot to say the same thing or something very similar in the same type of situation without much work. And we can deliver kind of consistent treatments that might allow us to estimate causal effects more precisely. The challenge, I think, will come as we begin to think about deploying chatbots or other kind of similar research tools in increasingly sophisticated social settings. And the fundamental paradox that I think is going to be the single greatest challenge for the field going ahead is that in order to develop valid human simulations, chatbots or any other kind of AI will have to learn the rules of social systems. And as they learn the rules of social systems, they'll fundamentally become less reliable. And as they learn the rules of social system, there's a high probability that they could become unethical. Even in the relatively simple study that I described at the outset, the one where we simply used bots to retweet Twitter messages, there was a substantial risk that our bots could have retweeted misinformation, offensive hate speech, and so on. And so I think as we look ahead, finding ways to optimize in this three-dimensional space, again, there may be even more dimensions, will be kind of the seminal challenge we face as we try to think about how to deploy bots, especially in field experiments and real world settings. If you want to learn more about this line of research, I invite you to check out the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science, which I co-founded with Matt Selgonic. I see a lot of former participants in the participant list of this conference. You can both attend one of our events, hopefully in person eventually, although it looks like most of the events will be online again this year, though we're hoping to fund as many as 19 new locations this year all over the world. We also have online resources, and I just want to flag those quickly. Those are new resources that you can access via our website, including a tutorial by Abdullah Al-Matouk, who I mentioned earlier. He developed the Empirica platform that we used for some of the research presented today. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments, and thanks again for having me, Dean, Sinan, and Sandy.
Thanks, Chris. That was really interesting. And so I think in just a moment we'll kind of hopefully start taking some more questions from the audience. I wanted to start with just the question of how we should think about this in commerce settings versus in research settings. So as researchers, we both maybe rightfully feel greater constraints on some of our behavior. We're trying to do things for the public good, but also sometimes we may feel justified in temporarily using deception, for example, because this is for this public benefit and we are going to debrief participants later. Have you thought about how some of these same issues apply when people are experimenting with things like chatbots in commerce?
Yeah, I think any of us who have spent time online or on the phone with a chatbot have experienced that moment where you're just not quite sure. I think, I mentioned earlier the uncanny valley, and I think these kind of ethical dilemmas are not well charted. I mean, the IRBs that I work with do not have any kind of protocols that are really well institutionalized around automated behavior. And to the extent that we should expect IRBs to be ahead of industry, that's a significant concern. Of course, in this area, industry's been navigating this issue for much longer than academia. So I suspect the innovation will have to run in the opposite direction to some degree, at least in this area. And so I look forward to seeing how we all saw 2 years ago Google Assistant deceive real people. And certainly, especially with GPT-3 and other innovations, I think we'll continue to see that. So I think we need simple descriptive work of what the public thinks of automation before we can really start to chart out what's best practice for both academics and industry.
And it seems like some of this may be a moving target, that people's expectations and ethical judgments about whether it's okay to use bots in different ways are going to change as we're maybe facing them in commerce so much. Yeah,
absolutely.
Cool. Well, I think actually there's some pretty interesting connections between these two talks, and so I wanted to start by exploring that a little bit, and we'll take some of the questions from the audience in a second. So please submit questions via Q&A. But I think one of the interesting things that this made me think of is what designs involving these kinds of bots might be used to explore these questions of moral outrage and punishment. And that also would seem to potentially go right along some of the ethical boundaries that we might want to explore, right? And whether that's having a bot punishing or transgressing or observing. And so I wonder if either one of you had thoughts about those kinds of research designs. And just to start with you, Jillian, I wonder if you've been exploring doing that kind of thing.
Sorry. Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I haven't in any concrete way been exploring it. I mean, I think the ethical question is really interesting of like, if we could imagine interventions that rely on creating some kind of a sense that people are being watched or that their reputation is at stake, like, could this be a tool to get sort of discourse to become more constructive or go in a direction that we think is good? But I mean, I also think it's like so hard to make a confident judgment about that in this space. And I think like there's a lot of debate even in this sort of domain of like outrage culture and critiques of it in terms of what we should think of as constructive outrage that's sort of activism and making the world better, and what we should think of as nasty, destructive, like discourse that's destroying the potential of these platforms for good. So I think the ethical questions would be really tricky, but that it's a super interesting sort of potential source of an intervention.
Yeah, I certainly agree, and I think in this area in particular, we're going to see a lot of innovation. Some of it will be difficult to pull off logistically, especially as platforms develop new rules for automated behavior. Even since we ran that original bot study, Twitter has changed its automation rules significantly. But there's an interesting follow-up to our study that was recently done by folks both at MIT and Yale, in which people were paid once again to interact with a bot. This time, the bots were direct messaging them. Now, this is another, that raises this other level of, frustration or annoyance of being messaged constantly. In this case, the bot had been asked to follow the people, or had followed the people and gotten a follow back, which enables direct messaging, of course, as many of you will know. But it enabled a pretty fascinating research question, which is, these were targeted accounts that were tweeting anti-immigrant messages. And the idea was to deliver kind of corrections about these messages. There's a wonderful earlier study that did something similar by Kevin Munger, who I saw in the program. If you haven't checked out his research, he's got a really fascinating project that used bots to censor racist language. But in this case, what the researchers did was essentially expose people to a bot that would give them counter-attitudinal messages, and they, from what I understand, observed the same effect that we did, this kind of backfire effect. People became more polarized, not less. But in another condition, the bots, if I understand the study correctly, retweeted congruent messages. So messages that were consistent with these people's anti-immigrant views, and then gradually introduced anti-immigrant messages. And these people seem to have become less polarized. So in this case, it seems like a really fascinating case of pacing and leading, an area where bots did show the potential to de-radicalize. I think we should probably, as a field, be adopting a first do no harm approach here, because until these are really well validated at scale, I'm a little nervous about deploying them on chat platforms or on social media sites. But I think at a minimum, it gives us some sense that there are opportunities here.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean that's a great example of one where it seems like it's these bots are really doing something that you maybe don't want them to do, which is to suggest these kind of counter your own attitude change goals messages, but they change over time, and maybe that works out to be effective. And that makes me think a little bit as well about just sort of who the imagined observers and audience is. And some of your work, Jillian, would suggest that maybe just having a different set of potential audience members might make people behave differently. So even relatively passive, but maybe not entirely passive bots might change people's behavior for the better or worse if they perhaps were polarized in some way and they thought that they would get reputational benefits from performing outrage in front of the bot or not. So it even suggests that this kind of minimal bot treatment could do a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't talk like too much about it in this short talk, but we've done some sort of more systematic evaluations of how the nature of the audience matters to people, and it definitely seems to matter. So for example, people expect relatively more moderate observers to sort of encourage them to differentiate more between ambiguous and unambiguous scenarios as compared to sort of relatively more ideologically extreme audiences. And so I think that like the nature of who we're connected to matters a lot for what we think the reputational incentives are encouraging us to do, and that's a big part of people's discourse.
Cool. So actually, just to change direction just a little bit, one of the questions we got, and it comes up a lot here at Code, is thinking about heterogeneous treatment effects. And so I think in in one of your studies, Jillian, you really wanted to sort of decompose the effect and look at these subgroups that were defined by, basically how ambiguous or how unambiguous they thought some transgression was. And so you just kind of broke that up into 4 bins. And I just sort of thinking about, what other approaches you considered taking there, in terms of trying to estimate what are essentially heterogeneous treatment effects there.
Yeah, I saw that question. So I think the 4 bins was sort of a practical matter in the sense that, like, of course, we could also do some kind of a more continuous analysis. And if you just look at if there's an interaction between people's continuous moral evaluation of the case for punishment and whether they were in the public or the private condition, we also don't find an interaction. So that sort of more continuous approach, as opposed to binning it, kind of tells the same story, that reputation matters regardless of your initial moral impression. The point of the binning, I think, was that you could imagine a possible way the results could have played out where there are differences, but like a continuous, it's not linear. So like a continuous approach doesn't capture that maybe like bins 2 and 3 show an effect and bins 1 and 4 don't, or something like that. And so we just sort of wanted to pre-register some subgroups that we could test the reputation effect within that would kind of capture different moral sentiments you could have. And that was just how we sort of practically chose to plan to do the analysis.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting tension or kind of aspect that is emerging to how to think about doing heterogeneous treatment effect analyses, is also like, what can we pre-register that is going to seem really transparent and that we understand ex ante how it's going to perform? Because certainly maybe you could have also pre-registered, oh, we're going to fit a causal forest, but then there's a lot of tuning parameters, and is this always going to be persuasive to different audiences, et cetera? So I think that's a challenging question. Actually, not unrelated to that, and something maybe, Krista, you could weigh in on as well, is we have a question about, why, Jillian, you focused on liberals in your experiments. Do you think that this kind of virtue signaling or sort of moralistic punishment and reputational considerations are stronger among liberals, or it was just that for this particular stimulus that it made sense to do it with Democrats? And so that's kind of another question about heterogeneity and symmetry, right? Because as well, and Chris, in one of the experiments you described, you kind of did everything both ways with, Democratic participants getting Republican stimuli, et cetera, et cetera. And so just thinking about, is that sort of a more theoretical phenomenon, or is that was just sort of useful for that one example?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I'm also saw the question was sort of directed to Chris as well. So, but the short answer is that in this case, we just kind of did a lot with this particular paradigm. And so we wanted to just develop one paradigm, and it happened to be about liberals. We've been doing some related experiments lately where we have people sign like a petition on change.org, and we manipulate people's reputational incentives to do that. And in that case, we're finding really similar results with a sort of liberal leaning petition and liberal subjects, or a conservative leaning petition and conservative subjects. So there we have people sort of punishing Amazon by insisting they take these shirts off their website that say Blue Lives Murder. And this is something that conservatives seem to perceive a reputational incentive to sign. But I actually think there's a very interesting question about if there are differences in virtue signaling and outrage motives between liberals and conservatives. I think it's like hard to test in the sense that it's hard to know how to create similar stimuli that of course will be different to match the moral issues that liberals and conservatives are more concerned with. But I think like the way outrage culture is discussed is that people kind of act like it's this liberal phenomenon. And I think it would be super interesting to do some kind of big analysis of language on Twitter or something to try to actually test if that's true.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Interestingly, we observed heterogeneity in treatment effects across political parties in both the first study I mentioned, where Republicans became more polarized than Democrats, but also the second study where exposing Republicans to a common enemy seems to have made them more polarized rather than less. And of course, there's a whole literature on this that goes deep into value systems and this kind of thing, which I think is really interesting. For me, in some of the more qualitative research I did in a new book that I mentioned, I've really come to conclude that identity threat is the mechanism here. And to some extent, when we think about the core identity of both parties, the Republicans simply have a much more coherent identity. The Democratic Party is a big tent. The Republican Party is more easily threatened as a group, as a set of ideas. So I personally think that has a lot to do with it. The other exciting development we've observed is in our latest experiment in the polarization lab, where we paired people to have cross-party conversations, we developed a technique which seems to have created asymmetric reductions in polarization that are stronger for Republicans. So once we figure out what the mechanism is, it seems like we can deliver the necessary treatment to kind of take into account those asymmetries. But I think it's obviously a question we'll all be talking about for some time.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's cool to see that you're making progress there. And that seems like actually a really interesting environment where these people are paired and there aren't these kinds of reputational considerations. And so it might be, I wonder if that could be an important part of some of these kinds of conversations, is that if people feel they're being watched by their normal audience, it may be hard to suggest kind of openness to other ideas or to attitude change. But when they're put in this environment where this conversation is not attached to their real name, they're interacting with people they normally wouldn't interact with, if that becomes actually a kind of a better space for attitude change, and that seems like that would actually be kind of an interesting connection between both of your lines of research.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so we're at the end of the time for this plenary session. Obviously, we could continue talking about this for a while, and in fact, we're going to head into break and networking in Gather, and so certainly we should all continue this conversation informally. Just as a reminder, if you are a parallel presenter in the next session, please, right at the beginning of the break, go into your Zoom session so that you can get set up and check things out. And then otherwise, if you're not a parallel presenter, just stay in Gather until it's time for the next session to begin, which is 11:15 a.m. Eastern. So thanks a lot to Jillian and Chris for kicking off the conference, and see you all in Gather.